So in a previous video lecture, when we were discussing formal and informal fallacies, we discussed a class of fallacies called fallacies of vagueness and ambiguity. One way that we can try to address the vagueness and ambiguity that's sometimes present in the language that we use for arguments is to make sure that we have good definitions for all of our key terms. So this lecture video is about definitions. What makes a good definition and how it is that we can try to use definitions when we argue or when we're in conversation with people where we're seeking the truth, when we're seeking the answer to some question. At the heart of this question of avoiding vagueness and ambiguity in our arguments and making sure that our terms are defined well is this question of when I make a claim, when I make a statement like, that's a dog, is that statement true or is it not true? Like, how do we know like when something is a dog? How do we know when something's not a dog? And we turn to like, well, what does it mean for something to be a dog? Really at the heart of this is this question of whether or not we're using concepts in a consistent and competent way, such that when we're in a conversation with somebody, if we're trying to figure out the truth of some sort of claim, like that's a dog, we want to have some sense of like, well, when does the concept dog apply and when does it not apply? So let's see if we can just kind of successfully navigate this. I'm not necessarily going to ask for a definition of dog. Let's just see if we can competently and consistently apply the concept dog starting here. That's a dog, right? Its fur is dyed to look a little bit like a tiger, but it's not a tiger, it's a dog. That's actually a tiger, so that one's not a dog. That's not a dog, that's a van that looks like a dog. That is a dog, though. What about that one? Nope, that's not a dog. It's a hot dog, so it's a dog, but a dog in another sense, right? That's not what we have been meaning when we're using the word dog. So no, that's not a dog. That's a hot dog. That's a dog in a hot dog bun. That's a hot dog. It's both. I don't know. Maybe that's both a hot dog and a dog. Maybe it's not really a hot dog, but it is a dog. But that's a dog for sure. That guy's a dog. That's a dog, but that's not a dog. That's a D-O-double-G dog, or maybe that's a lion. I don't know. I don't really keep up these days. No, not a dog in the sense that we've been using it here, right? But that is a dog. Okay. So it looks like we can pretty competently use and consistently use this concept of dog. So what about something a little more subtle? Let's look at another example. Let's look at hound dog. And by hound dog, I mean the song Hound Dog. My sense is if you are familiar with the song Hound Dog, you're probably familiar with the Elvis Presley version. That version goes a little something like this. You ain't nothing but a hound dog, crying all the time. You ain't nothing but a hound dog, crying all the time. You ain't never caught a rabbit and you ain't no friend of mine. That's Hound Dog, right? And everybody knows that that's Hound Dog, and Hound Dog is by Elvis Presley. But Hound Dog, as it turns out, is one of the most heavily litigated songs in the history of the music business. And this has to do with these questions of like, wait, hold on, is this the same song as this other song? If you know a little something more about the song Hound Dog, you maybe know that Elvis Presley did not write this song, or he lifted it from Big Mama Thornton. And perhaps there are all kinds of social and cultural points to be made here as well about white artists getting famous, copying songs that black artists did not get famous, did not get paid for. The Big Mama Thornton song, I think, is plausibly still the same song, if not because it's called Hound Dog. It's a little bit different, the lyrics are a little bit different, but the tune is definitely the same, and maybe the meaning is the same. Tell me if you think this is the same song as the Elvis Presley version of Hound Dog. You ain't nothing but a hound dog, was snooping round my door. You ain't nothing but a hound dog, always snooping round my door. You may wag your tail, but I ain't gonna pet you no more. So like I said, it's got the same title, it's got a lot of the same words, it's got the same tune. That's Hound Dog, right? That's the same song. And even though the words are different, thematically they kind of seem like they're singing about the same sort of thing. They're singing about some useless person that they're kind of not going to mess with anymore. But even though there's that thematic similarity, It seems like there's an important difference in the fact that there's this sexual component when Big Mama Thornton is talking about a hound dog as some kind of good-for-nothing guy, and when Elvis Presley is talking about it, it's got more of like, maybe, I don't know, like a platonic sense to it. That doesn't strike me as particularly compelling, though, if the question is Elvis Presley's hound dog pretty much the same? Is it essentially the same song as Big Mama Thornton's hound dog? And it seems like, yeah, they're the same thing, right? I can imagine somebody making the claim that, like, no, Elvis's version is different. I can imagine them having reasons, but yeah, I could see that, like, if the context is trying to figure out, does Big Mama Thornton deserve the commercial rights to Elvis Presley's hound dog, it seems like, yeah, she probably should, right? Because they're the same song. Elvis Presley's hound dog wasn't even the first time that somebody had been accused of copying Big Mama Thornton's hound dog. One of the most well-known early instances of this was another Sun Records recording by Rufus Thomas that had a different title and different words, but it seemed like it was singing about the same thing. That song is called Bearcat, and it goes like this. You ain't nothing but a bear cat, scratching round my door. You ain't nothing but a bear cat, scratching round my door. You may purr, pretty kitty, but I ain't gonna rub you no more. So I don't know, can we plausibly say that all three of these are the same song? This is all Hound Dog? Or I don't know, is Rufus Thomas's version, is that not Hound Dog? That's a different song, Bearcat? Hopefully we're getting this sense that there are some concepts that we seem to think about as unproblematic, but when it gets down to trying to police the boundaries between like where they apply and where they don't, things get a little bit more complicated. This gets even fuzzier too if we start thinking about like other songs that like, it seems like that maybe is the same song too. Like The Twist by Chubby Checker. Come on baby, let's do the twist. Come on baby, let's do the twist. Take me by my little hand and go like this. Wipeout by the Surfaris is also the same chord progression. So hopefully immediately we can get some sense that we can really get into trouble, or we can have some significant disagreements with other people about whether or not this particular song counts as an instance of hound dog or whether it doesn't. This is actually a really tricky issue. There are lots of words that we use, including words that represent very important concepts that we use on a regular basis, where policing this boundary between where the term applies and where it doesn't apply is actually really, really difficult, and the sort of thing that like we have to try to hash out with arguments. So this might be the goal of an argument, to kind of carve out where it is that the boundaries of terms should lie, or we might find that some other argument that we're making hinges on this question of where do we draw the boundaries between the important sorts of concepts that we're using. Another way of saying this is that in arguments we're usually concerned with definitions in order to establish what the extension of a term or a concept is. And all we mean by extension is like, where does it apply? How far does it apply? Where does it stop applying, right? Where's that boundary between where the concept can be correctly applied and where it can't be correctly applied? If we can help it. And this is kind of like, so now we're kind of recognizing that it's hard to come up with definitions. We don't always have very clear definitions. But if we can help it, we want to avoid definitions that are too loose, so to speak, that let in instances that don't belong. So for example, let's say I wanted to define the term dog. And I said, a dog is a four-legged furry pet. If that's my definition, notice that that's going to let in instances that don't actually belong for the concept dog. A cat is also a four-legged furry pet, but it's not a dog. So I want to avoid that if I can. I don't want a definition of dog that includes cats, right? I don't want a definition of dog that is too open. Also, if we can help it, we want to avoid definitions that are too narrow, that keep out instances that really should belong to the concept in question. So again, let's look at four-legged furry pet for dog, right? What about, is there like a possibility that we could have a three-legged dog? If we can have a three-legged dog, then there are going to be some dogs that are not captured by this definition of four-legged furry pet, right? So that definition is both too loose, it lets in instances that don't belong, but it's also too narrow, it keeps out instances that should belong to the term dog. Ideally, what we're looking for here is to pick out all and only those cases where the concept in question needs to apply. But as we said before, many concepts can't be so clearly and distinctly defined. If that language of all and only is familiar, recall that not so long ago we were talking about necessity and sufficiency, right? Necessary and sufficient conditions. And we use the same language. And this is because this is what a good definition should ideally do. And we said this before when we said, when I give necessary and sufficient conditions, I've precisely defined a concept. So that gives us some sense of like what it is that we're aiming for ideally with a definition, and also perhaps some sense that we're not always going to be able to get it. So how is it that we can go about some sort of process by which we identify terms that are vague and try to make them a little bit more precise, a little bit more well-defined? There's a habit that a lot of undergraduate students have of using dictionary definitions to define their key terms. It's probably worth pointing out that more often than not, this is going to annoy your professors. And that's because a dictionary definition is a good place to start in trying to define a key term, but it's very rarely a good place to end. At least in the context of talking about arguments, all the interesting arguments are ones where maybe the dictionary definitions are not good enough. Or perhaps we might point out that dictionary definitions give descriptions of how language typically is used, but in an argument we might find ourselves trying to make more prescriptive terms about how language is used. We might want to recognize that, like, yes, this word tends to be used like this, but we think it ought to be used in this other way, and that's where the issue that we're arguing about seems to hinge. So again, a dictionary might be a good place to start, but if you're trying to define some kind of key term that is the crux of some sort of question that you're inquiring into, you probably don't want to end with a dictionary definition. Another kind of a bad habit of undergraduate writing is that sometimes students will use examples when they're trying to define a term. And this is, it kind of works, but again, kind of like dictionary definitions, it's maybe a place to start, not a place to end. If we're really in the dark about what the extension of some term is, an example can be really, really useful. It can be used in what's known as an ostensive way, or we can offer an ostensive definition, where essentially what we're doing too is we're pointing out some kind of case and we're saying, not only is this an example of the class that I'm talking about, or an example of like a place where the term that I'm using applies, it's an exemplary example. It's a paradigmatic example. It exemplifies the class in question. So for example, if somebody wants to know what a guitar is, if they've never seen one before in their life, I can just pick one up and say, this is a guitar. And maybe this goes a long way towards defining, or at least kind of clarifying what it means when somebody says guitar. But note there that things like ukuleles or bass guitars are going to be confusing cases if all I have is some kind of exemplary case. This is because examples really only give sufficient conditions for membership in a class. If we're wondering, like, what's a guitar? And I say, this is a guitar. Well, if you're this, you are definitely going to be a guitar. Like, being this is a sufficient condition for being a guitar. But it doesn't give me necessary conditions of membership of the class guitar. Because after all, it's possible to be a guitar without being this guitar. This is famously addressed in a lot of Plato's dialogues, maybe nowhere quite as clearly as in the middle of Meno. This dialogue is a conversation between Socrates and Meno, where Meno asks Socrates if virtue is teachable or not, this kind of excellence in being a human. Can you teach somebody how to be a better person? And Socrates immediately says, how could I possibly know if virtue is teachable if I don't know what virtue is? And then the whole conversation turns into, like, so what is virtue? Meno gives up a whole bunch of examples of virtue, and Socrates keeps chiding him and saying, you're not telling me what virtue itself is. Meno says, I'm not really clear on what it is that you're asking me to do. Socrates explains, perhaps a little bit ironically, by giving some examples of what it is that he means. He says if somebody wanted you to define shape and you had said roundness, that person would kind of understandably say, you gave me a shape, but you didn't tell me what shape itself was. And that's because there are other shapes that aren't round, but are still shapes nonetheless. Socrates says you can do this with color as well. If somebody asked you to define what color was, if they weren't sure what color was, and you said whiteness is a color, or white is a color, if they followed up by asking this clarificatory question, like, are you telling me a color, or are you telling me what color itself is? It seems like Meno would have to concede, like, no, I've just given you an example of color because there are other colors that aren't white, but are no less colors than white is. So Socrates says, we keep coming to these particular cases, but I want the more general, abstract description of like what it is that all of those particular examples have in common. And this is what we mean when we say that giving examples can be a good start. If I can get a collection of exemplary cases where this concept does apply, maybe I can start getting into this process of wondering, what is it that all of those cases have in common? So what is it that's going to define the whole class? One strategy that we can employ to try to make sure that we're getting necessary and sufficient conditions in our definitions is to take this kind of genus-species approach to defining a term. The genus here refers to some kind of larger class that my concept belongs to. And I want to identify like what is that big class that my concept belongs to, and then I'll also articulate what the speciating difference is between my concept and all of the other members of that class. So for example, we saw this when we were talking about necessary and sufficient conditions. We can define bachelors as unmarried males. So suppose here we're saying that males is the genus and the unmarried males is that speciating difference. Notice that when I specify males, I've got a necessary condition for being a bachelor, and then I go on and add that speciating difference of saying not all the males, the unmarried males in particular, that's who I'm talking about. Now I've got both necessary and sufficient conditions. This is a strategy that might not always be available. Just because I provide some sort of genus and species doesn't mean I've got a good definition. But it's a kind of like a common pattern that we see in a lot of very precise definitions that are able to give necessary and sufficient conditions. If we want to apply this to other cases that are a little more vague than bachelor, say something like love. What is love? That's a very difficult concept to try to define, but if I start with a genus, if I start with something like, well, love is an emotion, I know it's an emotion, maybe that gets me well on my way to thinking about, okay, well, if that's true, that love does belong to the genus emotion, what's the speciating difference? What is it that makes love different than all the other kinds of emotions? What is it that makes love different than hate or confusion or some other sort of emotional state? Even if I am able to execute that genus-species sort of strategy for defining a term, I might still not quite get what it is that I'm looking for. And this maybe we might capture by talking about the way that definitions are supposed to give me the essence of the concept that they're defining. I want to capture all of the essential characteristics of the class that's being defined. So, for example, famously, Aristotle discusses a possible definition of human where he says featherless bipeds, right? So if we're talking about all the things that walk on two legs, and we might notice that, like, well, birds also walk on two legs. Is there anything else? Maybe Aristotle doesn't know about kangaroos or any of the other animals that walk on two legs. If it were true that humans were the only bipeds without feathers, then perhaps that would give me a genus and species, right? That would give me a precise definition of what it means to be a human. We get this sense that, like, it doesn't actually work because I can just pluck a chicken and then I have a featherless biped, but that's maybe not what's wrong with featherless biped as a definition of human, because it doesn't capture what it is to be a human. It doesn't capture that essential characteristic. We might find that the animal capable of reason, so the genus there is animal, and capable of reason is the speciating difference that makes humans different than all of the other animals. That maybe does a better job than featherless biped. It might have the same sort of problems by admitting some members that don't belong, or maybe excluding some members that should belong. We might notice that there might be some humans that are not capable of reason because they have a profound cognitive disability. Or we might note that there are some non-humans that perhaps are capable of reason, but even still we can kind of get this sense that animal capable of reason perhaps is a better definition than featherless biped for human because it gets closer to what the essential characteristics of being a human are. So we've got some idea of like things that we should be trying to do and things that we should be trying to avoid when we're trying to define our terms. For example, try to make sure that your definition gives both necessary and sufficient conditions for membership in the class that's being defined. Therefore, maybe try to avoid giving definitions that are too narrow. Try to avoid giving definitions that are too loose, that don't give you all and only those circumstances that the concept really applies. We've mentioned that while you might want to start with a dictionary definition, or you might want to start with a couple of examples, that's not really good enough for a very precise definition, so I want to avoid ending the conversation with that. We mentioned that a genus species sort of a strategy might be a good idea. That's the sort of a thing that could help me when I'm trying to define a term, and that we want to try to capture the essential characteristics of the concept. To go a little further, here are some more things that you probably want to avoid when you're defining key terms in your argument. Here's one that you probably already know. Don't use circular definitions, right? Don't use the term that you're defining in the definition of that term. For example, if we're wondering what it means to be a virtuous person, and our answer is being a virtuous person. Here's the definition of being a virtuous person. It's being a person who has virtuous character. That's clearly a circular definition. I'm using a key aspect of the definiendum, that's the thing that I'm trying to define, in the definiens, the thing that's doing the defining. I can also see some patterns of circularity here if I was to say, for example, what is the definition of condescending? And I look up in the dictionary and I find a definition that says something like to be condescending is to speak to somebody in a patronizing tone. And then I go look up patronizing in the dictionary and I get a definition that says to speak to somebody with condescension. We have some circularity there as well, right? So I want to avoid that. I also maybe want to avoid defining one concept in terms of another or other more vaguely defined concepts. A pretty typical exercise in a first day of a philosophy class is to try to talk about what it is that philosophy is, to try to define philosophy. And oftentimes what you'll hear is a literal definition that the word philosophy comes from the Greek philosophia, philein sophia, which is to love wisdom. Philosophy is the love of wisdom. But maybe this doesn't really help, right? Maybe I've now replaced one vague term, philosophy, with two terms that are just as vague, maybe if not more confusing, love and wisdom. Additionally, you want to not fall prey to, and certainly not intentionally use, what are known as persuasive definitions. We saw this in the discussion of informal fallacies when we talked about the no true Scotsman fallacy, which is one fallacy that's associated with fallacies of vagueness and ambiguity. This is closely related to not falling prey to definitions that beg the question. If I'm trying to navigate some sort of controversy, I probably want to avoid using definitions that one side of the controversy is going to agree with, but the other side of the controversy is just going to reject out of hand, right? For example, if we're trying to navigate the question of whether or not the death penalty is a just form of punishment, and somebody defines punishment as seeking retribution, well, this might be the sort of thing that those who oppose the death penalty are just not going to be on board with. They're not going to see punishment that way. If that's the way that I'm defining punishment in a conversation about whether or not the death penalty is a just form of punishment, it seems like I've already stacked the deck in favor of one conclusion rather than the other. I am, it seems in this case, begging the question at hand. Try to keep in mind here that the definitions of terms aren't these things that are fixed in stone. Language is a living, kind of a constantly evolving thing. So we should maybe try to think of our efforts to define our terms in a conversation with other people as this negotiation that's going on between me and my interlocutors. We're trying to work out how it is that the key terms of this discussion are going to get used as we continue to discuss. And so those need to be the sorts of things that everybody who's participating in the conversation needs to be able to plausibly sign on to. Case in point, we're on the doorstep of our first argument analysis assignment. That's going to be posted soon. And that assignment is to try to navigate this question, are esports genuine sports? And what we mean by esports are a kind of variety of things that maybe might typically be classified as video games that also have this characteristic of sport that goes along with them. Perhaps a necessary preliminary question for addressing are esports genuine sports asks us to define what a sport is. So clearly, I'm going to need to turn to some sort of definition of sport in order to determine whether or not esports are genuine sports. And I want to do that in a way that's sensitive to all of these things that we've been talking about what makes definitions good and what makes definitions not work out so well. So things that I want to be thinking about here when I try to define sport in order to determine whether esports are genuine sports, I want to look at some examples, right? I want to start there at least. I want to start with examples, and maybe want to start with a dictionary definition, but I probably shouldn't want to end there. And the examples that I examine, they should probably be exemplary examples, and I should maybe keep track of other examples of sport that are maybe boundary cases, things that kind of qualify as sport, but I don't know if they're like really exemplary. You might want to think about trying to make a genus-species approach to defining what a sport is. Hot tip, a plausible genus for sport might be game, right? So like there's the class of all games. Some games are sports, other games maybe aren't sports. What's the speciating difference? We see that's that genus-species strategy towards defining a sport. I want to make sure that I capture the essential characteristics of sport. So if sports are interesting, if I care at all, or if anybody cares whether esports should count as genuine sports, what is it that seems to be on the line? Why would people disagree about this? Why would they care about the disagreement? What is it about sport that is interesting? What are its essential characteristics that we care about it at all? And last but not least, don't be circular in your definition. Don't define sport by employing the word sport, and don't beg the question. Note that there are going to be two interesting sides in some sort of dispute about whether or not esports are genuine sports, and we want to pick a definition of sport that's going to seem plausible to all of the parties involved. If I can't do that, I'm probably going to need to justify why it is that I'm defining sport in that way and not in some other alternative way, which is to say I'm going to need to provide some additional backup arguments for that argument that uses that definition. I encourage you to start thinking about this now, like how it is that you're going to define sport and what sort of a definition you're going to need in order to settle this dispute about whether or not esports are genuine sports. Think about it on your own, do a little bit of kind of internet sleuthing, find some arguments that other people have made, talk to your friends and family about this. Think about like how it is that sport ought to be defined, and then how it is that I'm going to be able to use that definition in order to settle some sort of dispute, right? In order to navigate this question. That's all for this lecture video. Look forward to seeing you in the next one. All right, and until then, take care.